The development of the American battle line in the modern world dates back to the late 19th century as she emerged from her Civil War and started to project her power first locally and then onto a world stage. As the nation grew, the need for the Navy and as technology developed, it led to some interesting and odd-looking ships and/or ideas, especially when it came to the battle line, of which the battleships range from more conventional battleships like these to conversions for other purposes and/or ideas that were more outlandish like torpedo battleships. In this video, we're going to look at some of the strangest battleships and/or ideas for the American battle fleet. USS Wyoming, a battleship that started life off as a normal one and ended it as a testbed for many new and exciting ideas following the Second World War. Originally, she was a Dreadnought-style battleship displacing some 27,000 tons and was powerfully armed with 12 12-inch guns and a top speed of around 21 knots. She served in the First World War with the Grand Fleet and returned to the United States following the war and continued to drill and sail around with the rest of the American battle line. We'll pick up her story in August 1927 when Wyoming was to be modernized. BB-32, as she had been designated since 1920, had been having a rough time of it as of late. Her machinery, old as it was restricting her to 14 knots by 1924 and realistically a range of 6,700 nautical miles at 10 knots, instead of the 8,000 she was designed for. So a rebuild of her machinery was in order. To do this, the ship was fitted with new oil-fired boilers and turbines, and the uptakes were altered for a single funnel. With these new turbines and boilers, it essentially meant that the ships were back to where they were when they started. An example that Dr. Norman Friedman uses in his book, U.S. Battleships and Illustrated History, is USS Florida, as on her trials after her reconstruction, she recorded 22¼ knot top speed as compared to her originals when she achieved just over 22 knots. Now, that's not to say there weren't other additions that affected their speed, as an important one was the addition of a torpedo blister for underwater protection. It also was a good time to revise other features, like rangefinders, the rear cage mast, and soon enough the forward one, the secondary battery, given the advancements in aircraft technology, just to name a few. Given the extent of this overhaul, it surprisingly only lasted several months, as she was out and having a shakedown cruise by November 1927. Wyoming returned to service with the battleships for a short period, and by November 1940, she became flagship of the training squadron. Considering her age, and the fact that she had been training sailors for several years, it made sense. This change in roles was shortly followed by the First London Naval Treaty. Because of that, ships like the Royal Navy's Iron Duke or the Imperial Japanese Navy's Hiei, Wyoming, like those other ships, was to be demilitarized. Wyoming lost her recently acquired blisters, side armor, and the removal of guns and turret machinery from 3 of her 6 turrets. Her machinery was gutted with the removal of one boiler, dropping her top speed to 18 knots. This demilitarization was finished in June 1931, and she commenced training cruises around European waters. During this cruise, in July, she was redesignated AG-17, a miscellaneous auxiliary, where over the next 4 years and beyond, Wyoming continued her summer cruises for Naval Academy midshipmen and training cruises for sailors of other universities. During the late 1930s, she participated in several amphibious exercises where some thought she might play a future role as a specialized assault ship. In 1940, some thought was put into arming her with more anti-aircraft guns and other smaller caliber weapons to serve in this commando ship role. Others, especially the fleet training staff, wanted the ship to be another Utah, or at least a more dedicated training ship of some sort. The General Board ruled in favor of this less radical option. By late 1940, as Utah was receiving more radical changes to her armament, Wyoming maintained her main battery of guns and the remaining 5-inch 51 caliber guns with a few anti-aircraft guns here and there, these being 20mm guns and 50 caliber machine guns. When on December 7, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and the United States entered the Second World War, Wyoming was a gunnery training ship on the East Coast. She soon became known as the Chesapeake Raider, as she patrolled the area so frequently on her gunnery training cruises and the amount of ammunition she fired. Anyway, by July of 1942, her anti-aircraft guns were being upgraded with the addition of more 20mm guns and 40mm guns, along with the removal of the 50 caliber machine guns. These were further augmented throughout the next several years with more 20mm mounts and 5-inch 38 caliber mounts, with those occupying some of the empty barbettes lining the main deck or anywhere they could find room on the ship. The Chesapeake Raider helped to train thousands of gunners on the various anti-aircraft guns of the fleet, ranging from the 5-inch mounts to smaller anti-aircraft guns. The large refit that transformed her further came in January 1944. Seeing how she was an anti-aircraft training ship, she had no need for her remaining 12-inch 50 caliber guns, and they were promptly removed, which merely occupied space better devoted to additional anti-aircraft weapons, as well as the surviving 50 caliber machine guns, as there were still a few around. These turrets were replaced by twin 5-inch 38 caliber guns and another Mark 37 Director, giving Wyoming a total of 14 5-inch 38 caliber guns at this point, along with 3-inch mounts, 1.1-inch, and other smaller anti-aircraft guns. The Chesapeake Raider continued to train gunners until 1945, when the urgent need for new anti-aircraft measures to counter the kamikaze threat called her to New York for another refit, becoming flagship of Task Force 69 out of Casco Bay for anti-aircraft research, headed by Admiral Willis Lee, the decorated battleship admiral of USS Washington fame. Unfortunately, Lee suffered a heart attack one day while heading out for experiments and passed away. Wyoming continued to serve in Task Force 69, which eventually became the Operational Development Force operating out of Norfolk, which tested all sorts of new equipment and, of course, further alterations to her battery and equipment. On July 11, 1947, Wyoming entered Norfolk Naval Shipyard and was decommissioned on August 1st, with a lot of her material and crew being transferred to USS Mississippi. The life of USS Wyoming was certainly a long-lasting one in which she served her country in many different roles, from frontline battleship to training the sailors of the fleet in all manner of ship handling, especially gunnery during the Second World War. If you've seen my video on weird Russian battleships, you'd know I mentioned the fact that some in the United States Navy were keen on developing a torpedo battleship. This idea developed a bit earlier in the United States Navy. Although battleships had carried torpedoes as early as 1875, they weren't a serious explosive risk, as demonstrated by the Spanish-American War. Still, as the technology related to the torpedo developed, and so did gun ranges, the Naval War College of the United States began to experiment in war games, and they found that fleets that used the torpedo effectively decisively won the engagement over an enemy who didn't, resulting in the General Board requesting battleships be given 1 or 2 submerged torpedo tubes. Where to quote Dr. Friedman, "The next logical step was a capital ship armed primarily with torpedoes. W.L. Rogers, the later president of the Naval War College, proposed such a craft during the 1903 session of that institution. Although it was evaluated in some detail, Rogers' proposal did not progress further, probably because of advances in gunnery that extended the likely battle range well beyond 3,000 yards. The idea was revived 3 years later by Lieutenant Commander Frank Herman Schofield. Schofield, while serving in the Bureau of Ordnance, proposed a moderate-sized, 23-knot ship that was to be impervious to shell fire, armed with 16 21-inch torpedo tubes, the largest guns being 12 5-inch 50 caliber guns. The weight saved on guns would go to armor, and the displacement would be around 14,000 tons. Schofield thought that a torpedo hit would probably cripple and or sink its target, and with increasing gun ranges, it made it very difficult for conventional battleships to use their torpedoes. And with this proposed torpedo battleship, they could close with the enemy and sow chaos in their line, and allow the big gun battleships to handle the remainder of the fleet, not too far off from the Russian idea. In war games, it was found that 2 such torpedo vessels proved effective in battle, where again taking from Dr. Friedman, "So radical suggestion was of great interest, not least as an equalizer to spring on numerically superior foreign fleets. The natural test was the well-developed gaming facility at the Naval War College. The main problem was how to interpret Schofield's assumptions concerning the vulnerability of his ships. Presumably, it would have been no advantage as far as underwater damage was concerned. Now, we see that even the assumption of parity would have been optimistic, as the spaces devoted to underwater torpedo tubes would have been weak points in any underwater protection system. Indeed, this was a major reason for the ultimate abandonment of the submerged torpedo tubes. However, it was a point not sensed for some years. The War College played out its games and found that the contemplated usefulness of Schofield's design depends on excess of speed, which must be considerable. The excess speed of a Schofield over the Dreadnought is only 2 knots. The assumption further includes no vessel of the enemy capable of neutralizing the Schofields, which is not a safe assumption. The British Invincible type is 2 knots faster, has a battery superior to any battleship in commission excepting the Dreadnought, has a torpedo armament about half as great as the Schofield, but is not so heavily armored, though they are still very well protected. The committee would go on to say that they thought Schofield's design could be a useful addition to the battle line, in the right circumstances, of course. Still, they recommended more heavily armored, conventional battleships over this unique torpedo design. Schofield was not convinced, and he continued to develop his ideas, eventually resubmitting his designs in 1911 for a series of tactical games. This time, battlecruisers were included in the tactical games, and any attempt by the torpedo battleship to close with the enemy line was met with superior gunfire. Although the torpedo had a range of 6,000 yards now, the guns could hit at twice the range. The conclusion from this game was that the torpedo battleship was vulnerable, especially from attacks by destroyers, and money could be more usefully spent on those and more conventional battleships. Schofield, ever the persistent man, objected to this, feeling that the games were rigged against his ships, but the battleship was not again taken up by the General Board. The torpedo battleship work was picked up by another individual, R.H. Robinson, who headed the design branch, and the studies were intended for Schofield's use at Newport. They formed an interesting contrast to Robinson's work on battlecruisers. Schofield still stayed involved over the coming years with the torpedo battleship, and Dr. Friedman writes, "In both cases, high speed and heavy armor were demanded, and in consequence, a very long hull had to be used. This, in turn, implied unusually great bending stresses, even as here in the absence of such concentrations of weight as gun mounts." By this time, Schofield had accepted the necessity for some gun armament. One of his ideas was for the use of a single triple or even quadruple 14-inch turret forward. His ship would use her very considerable speed advantage to achieve a position in which she could rake a column of advancing ships. The target involved would be so large that the ship would not need to be a particularly strong gun platform to achieve hits. Hence, a very large metacentric height, providing considerable security against underwater attack, would be acceptable. In the summer of 1912, using some of Robinson's studies, the torpedo battleship was made bigger in progressive alterations, displacing over 30,000 tons and machinery for at least 27 knots, moving to 30 or 31 knots with the 14-inch gun arrangement and as many as 46-inch guns, with a reduction of the torpedoes to 8. Some of the criticism of the design was for mounting the 14-inch guns all forward and the weight of the machinery, as it would need to be extremely large to produce 115,000 shaft horsepower to achieve that 31-knot top speed. Although this much reduced version, in terms of torpedoes, had more prospects, as the General Board was impressed by torpedoes aboard capital ships, and with more guns, it could have been more impressive to the General Board. Still, the underwater torpedo was desired on newer, more conventional battleships. The General Board desired the battleship of 1915 to have as many as 6 broadside torpedo tubes, but compromises were made for the machinery. Once again, Dr. Friedman writes, "War experience soon suggested, however, that the underwater torpedo tube might not be so good an idea. In January 1916, the Bureau of Ordnance reported that torpedoes could be fired at any speeds much beyond 16 knots. Examples of underwater damage emphasized the weakness the after torpedo rooms represented, and in the end, they were ordered omitted. Policy changed again in 1921. From the South Dakota's BB-49 class on, ships would only have above-water tubes. Early plans for battleship reconstruction also included these weapons. Not until 1924 was the elimination of all capital ship torpedo tubes seriously advocated. Although the torpedo battleship concept had been developed in the 1900s and 1910s and had not been seriously considered since then, This was certainly the official death blow to the concept in the United States Navy. Our next and final battleship we're going to take a look at is USS Utah, a Florida-class battleship commissioned in 1911, a predecessor to the Wyoming, being armed with 10 12-inch guns on a 21,000-ton displacement and a top speed of just under 21 knots. Utah, much like Wyoming, participated in World War I and many of the post-war drills, refits, and other activities battleships of the American fleet did. Where her story gets interesting is in 1930, with the London Naval Treaty, as much like Wyoming, she was demilitarized. However, instead of becoming a training vessel like Wyoming, she became a radio-controlled target ship, where she was stripped of her guns and remained in appearance a battleship, in that her empty turrets remained in place, and her casemates were merely covered over. She even retained her cage foremast and polemast. However, by the treaty, she was entirely disarmed. She was reclassified AG-16 and recommissioned in 1932, passing her radio control trials, and to quote from the excellent website Naval History and Heritage Command, "Over the next 9 years, the former battleship performed a vital service to the fleet as a mobile target, contributing realism to the training of naval aviators in dive, torpedo, and high-level bombing. Thus, she greatly aided the development of the tactics in those areas. On one occasion, she even served as a troop transport, embarking 223 officers and men of the Fleet Marine Force at Sand Island, Midway, for amphibious operations at Hilo Bay, Hawaii, as part of Fleet Problem 16 in the early summer of 1935. She then transported the Marines from Hawaii to San Diego, California, disembarking them on June 12, 1935. That same month, June 1935, saw the establishment of a fleet machine gun school on board Utah, where she continued her mission as a mobile target ship. The former Dreadnought received her first instructors on board in August 1935. The first students drawn from the ship's companies of the light cruisers Raleigh, Concord, Omaha, Memphis, and Milwaukee, and the aircraft carrier Ranger, reported aboard for training on September 20th. Subsequently, during the 1936 and 1937 gunnery year, Utah was fitted with a new quadruple 1.1-inch machine gun mount for experimental test and development by the Machine Gun School. Some of the first tests of that type of weapon were conducted on board. The reason for those tests is that by the late 1930s, the battle fleet needed anti-aircraft training far more than target practice against ship targets. In 1935, the Utah was converted into a fleet machine gun school, and because of her versatility as demonstrated by that quote, she was described as one of the most useful vessels in the fleet. Besides serving as a realistic target for exercises involving carrier-based planes, she also towed targets during battle practices conducted by the fleet's battleships and took part in that year's fleet problems. And after providing mobile target services for the submarines of Submarine Squadron 6 in the late autumn and winter of 1939, Utah devoted the next 8 months to special machine gun work. During the summer of 1939, she was refit with 4 5-inch 25 caliber guns and 2 quadruple 1.1-inch machine cannons. Utah became a general-purpose training ship. The following summer, Utah sailed for the Hawaiian Islands. She operated as an anti-aircraft gunnery school in the Hawaiian operating area until sailing back to the west coast, doing similar services for the ships stationed there. Eventually, she made her way back to the east coast and a second refit at Puget Sound, this time with 4 5-inch 38s and a total battery of 8 5-inch guns, 2 quad 1.1-inch, and 16 50 caliber machine guns, along with 20mm guns which were added later on. She also received repairs and alterations during the spring 1941 refit, and even received a fresh coat of paint, more apt for possible wartime service. Utah made her way to Hawaii by September of that year, performing her duties as an anti-aircraft gunnery drill ship over the coming months, until the fateful morning of December 7th, 1941. Shortly before 8 a.m., Utah was moored off Ford Island in berth F-11. Men on the ship noticed 3 aircraft on maneuvers heading in a northerly direction from the harbor and began diving on Ford Island where the seaplane hangars were, and began dropping bombs. We're again taking from Naval History and Heritage Command. The attack on the fleet at Pearl Harbor lasted a little under 2 hours, but it was over in a few minutes for Utah. At 8:01, soon after sailors had begun raising the colors at the ship's fantail, the erstwhile battleship took a torpedo hit forward and immediately started to list to port. As the ship began to roll ponderously over on her beam ends, 6 by 12-inch timbers placed on the decks to cushion them against the impact of the bombs during the ship's latest stint as a mobile target began to shift, hampering the efforts of the crew to abandon ship. Below, men headed topside while they still could. Shortly before 8:12 a.m., the mooring line snapped and Utah rolled over. Her survivors struck out for shore, with some taking shelter under the mooring key since Japanese strafers were active. 58 men were killed in Utah's sinking, and she was officially stricken from the Naval Register later on. She was partially righted to clear an adjacent berth, but her partially submerged hulk still remains in Pearl Harbor. She also received 1 battle star for her services in the Second World War. The ships on this list just scratch the surface of ideas and/or unique conversions for the United States battleships. In the future, I plan on covering more of them, especially Mississippi and her role following the Second World War. Hopefully you found this look at these American battleships interesting. I always love looking at the United States Navy, but for whatever reason, it doesn't seem to interest you all, based on YouTube statistics. Anyway, please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, my friends, have a great week.